Okay, so welcome to AIM Research. I'm Kate Hayward. I'm the host for this event, and thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. This event is hosted by the Center for Academic Innovation and aims to act as a center for conversation, inspiration, and research to inform educational innovation of all kinds. If you have ideas for people we should invite to come join us for one of these, please do send them our way. I'm putting the URL for you to see all of Academic Innovation's events in the chat for your reference. We have a great series of events this year, and I'm really excited about them. And I'm particularly thrilled today for us to be joined by Montserrat, a doctoral candidate. I hear she's defending her proposal tomorrow. Very exciting progress. And I love getting to cheer people along as they navigate these academic milestones. She is a doctoral candidate in the quantitative track of the Qualitative and Quantitative Research Methodology PhD program at Indiana University, Bloomington. She obtained an MS in statistics in 2020 from IUB. And she currently works as a graduate researcher in the Office of Analysis and Institutional Effectiveness Research and Analytics. Her main research interest is fairness in assessments when comparing heterogeneous populations. Her dissertation consists of 3 simulation studies focused on the fairness and validity of international large-scale assessment results under the implementation of adaptive testing designs. Her collaborations include studies improving item by group fit method to detect item bias at the group level and evaluating item bias effects in cognitive diagnostic models. Monse, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the introduction. And, thanks to you and Becky Matz for the invitation to participate today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully I'm sharing the right one. Yeah, I think I am. Not the presenter view, right? Okay, great.
We can see your slides. It looks perfect.
That's great. Let's go. So once again, thank you for the invitation to participate today. I'm going to talk about a project that I conducted with the research and analytics team at the Office of Analysis and Institutional Effectiveness at IUB. And to start talking about this project, I'm going to give a little bit of context of what fairness in assessment is, and then the methods for detecting item bias, the application of item bias detection methods, and some recommendations based on this project that I did. So let's go with a brief introduction of fairness in assessment. I'm almost certain that most of the participants today had to take a test or assessment at some point of their lives. Assessments are extremely useful for accountability in education. Assessments can provide a level playing field for the pursuit of many desirable goals, such as promotion, admission, and scholarship. And so there's a field that studies assessments, and it's known as psychometrics. And psychometricians are concerned or are interested in the quality of assessment, particularly in 2 desirable qualities: validity and reliability. Any measurement tool should have a purpose. For example, let's say we're going to measure reading for entering college students, right? And so when we build an assessment based on that purpose, we're going to get eventually score. And we associate an interpretation to that score. For example, and it's something that I've heard, attending to college and even throughout my educational career, if a student got an A+, usually things like you're doing an excellent job in this class, or you have what it takes to pass this class, or you're understanding well the material, are typically interpretations that people give based on the score of a test. So when does fairness become a main desirable quality of assessment? It has a historical context. And so I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the assessment history in America. And I'm going to start with a moment where we move from oral examinations. Around 1840, the formal written tests begin to replace oral examinations. And this happens roughly at the same time as the schools change their mission from serving the elite to educating the big population, the masses, if you want. So after 1875, there is a big development and administration of assessments, written assessments, attentive at evaluating how well students prepare for college. In the next 10 years or so, college entry examinations become very common and widespread. The idea, it's really, I think it points at fairness in that you have a common assessment that anyone could take to access college level education. So these assessments are meant to level the playing field for college admissions. Later, we learned that this was not necessarily the case, but that was the intention. In the next 30 years or 3 decades of the first 20th century, standardized testing becomes mainstream. We have Columbia University developing standardized achievement tests that measure students' proficiency in arithmetic, handwriting, spelling, drawing, reading. You have the College Board administer the first scholastic aptitude test, SAT, in 1926. And this test at the time is aimed to measure proficiency in knowledge of vocabulary and basic math. I think it's also important to notice that, or to recognize that all this evolution has a very dark side of assessment and fairness in assessment when it comes to IQ tests. So the idea behind the test was to identify students with disabilities who needed special help. And this test was built in France, but when it came to the US, it came with a lot of misuses, if you want, and a lot of adaptations that were now featured to measure intelligence. And this was largely embraced by the eugenics movement. And it had implications to perpetuate racial and ethnic biases and stereotypes. So I just want to make sure that I recognize the history, because it's not all, good intentions. It also has a very dark side. I think after the World War II, in 1947, we have the creation of the Educational Testing Service with the aims, or ETS for those who know, with the aims to develop, administer tests, to conduct research, and to advise educational institutions. During the 70s, ETS was the nation's leading testing organization, with hundreds of different large-scale tests being administered, such as the SAT, the GRE, the LSAT, all these tests that you may be familiar with. Also, it's important that in these years, there is such a development when it comes to understanding validity as a main desirable quality in assessment. And I think ETS and research institutions such as the universities you and me are at advance largely methods and theory of measurement and assessment in education. In the early 80s, however, ETS had large criticisms regarding its tests. Researchers claimed that ETS tests were culturally biased in favor of white and upper middle class people, and that they were poor predictors of actual performance. I think this is such an important part of the history of assessments, because when we start criticizing well-established institutions and practices, it makes people reflect on fairness in assessment. And so we have something in my field that are called the standards of educational and psychological testing, which are guidelines to actually have good assessments. In the second edition of these standards, in 1985, was the first edition that contained 2 chapters addressing concerns for specific groups of examinees: linguistic minorities, such as English as second language learners, and also people with disabilities. The next edition, 1999, is when there's a specific chapter on fairness in testing and test use. And this chapter addresses fairness, or defines fairness, as lack of bias and equitable treatment in the testing process. The latest edition is 2014, and of course it's a whole chapter, but here I take two main things that are important to understand fairness in testing. First is that a test that's fair reflects the same construct for all test takers, and that the scores that come from that test should have the same meaning for all individuals. So in these two important definitions or parts of the definitions of fairness, we see two important ideas, I think: equality and equity. Equality is basically equal treatment, right? And sometimes we interchangeably use equality and equity when in reality there are two different ideas. Equity is not equal treatment. It's not giving everyone the same thing. Equity means justice or fairness in the way people are treated. And so you're giving people what they need. In this image, and I know it might be overused, but I really like the image because it shows that a person who's on a wheelchair doesn't need a cube, you know, it needs a ramp. And that is important in the way we're understanding fairness in my field as well, because I think we should be heading towards a culturally responsive assessment. But that doesn't mean that we cannot use practices and methods that have been used up until this part. With that in mind, I would love to ask you a question, and I would love your participation. So I'm just going to add in the chat a link that you can access. You can also scan the QR code with your phone or go to slido.com and enter this number. And if you don't mind, please go ahead and start responding to the question. The question is, have you ever taken a test that you felt was unfair? Oh my goodness, it's amazing to see that most of the people, well, it's not amazing, it's actually, I expected that to happen, but I absolutely have taken a test that was unfair, more than one test. And before coming to this field, I always thought that assessments were somewhat unfair in general. So we have 22 participants. I'm going to wait a little longer, but so far, clearly the trend looks like we have a lot of people who have taken or felt that a test was unfair at some point. Now, the next question is guided to those people who actually are teachers or are professors. And my question is the following. Have you ever given a test you felt was unfair? And you can click the same link. It should take you to the page, or again, scan the QR code, or go to the slido.com page and enter that number. Okay, I love to see how this is moving, because I would have to say that from all the tests or assessments that I've given to my classes, I do feel that I wasn't, you know, unfair to my students in general. But of course, how much do we know of that? Thank you for all the people who are voting, by the way. So from 8 people who voted in this session, and I don't want to say the majority because we're 22, 21 without me, 75% feel that they weren't unfair in the test that they've given throughout their life. I think this is super important, especially when we compare these two responses, right? As test takers, we feel that tests are unfair, but when we are test administrators or examiners, we don't feel that we give tests that are unfair. And with a similar vein, we had a magnificent professor, Latina woman from the business school, who came and say, look, during my past semester, I administered the test that I've been conducting for several years and years. and that I actually designed the questions, etc. And one of my colleagues made me notice that, or said that my tests are biased, specifically when it comes to racial bias. So I would like to know if, there's a way I can see if my items have bias. And I was so happy to get into this work because it's a lot of what I do in my own research. So I'm going to talk to you about item bias detection methods, particularly differential item functioning. So diff refers to a situation in which test takers who are considered to be equally proficient on the construct measure, but who come from different groups, have a different probability of responding to an item correctly. In other words, these methods match test takers from different groups on the proficiency being measured and look for performance difference on an item. So let's look at this graph. We have a group of people that are on the red group and a group of people that are identified on the blue. And this is just a density function on their scores, okay? Or a normal line, if you want, on their scores. And what we see on these distributions is that clearly it looks like the blue group seems to have done a little better. If actually we would check the means, we would see that the blue group has 85 as the mean and the red group has 80. Now, we could just say, okay, this group performed better, but how do we know if that test, is actually doing the job of comparing fairly these two groups? What we do is we take an interval, as you can see in my dotted lines, and let's say we just compare the people who are scoring the same. So again, we're comparing people from different groups that perform equally well, right? That have scores between 80 and 82, let's say. So the differences cannot be attributable to the performance in the test. And we do this across all intervals. And I'm sorry that these slides are not perfect, but the idea is that we do it across all the distribution. In a more formal way, if we have a vector, a dummy variable, if you want, where we have 0 and 1 that identifies group from people from one group and another group A and B, and then we have a 2PL model. And I'm not going to go into the details of a two-parameter logistic model. What I need you to know is the following. We have a probability of responding correctly to item I, expressed by a function that depends on the proficiency of person N, on the item difficulty, on the item discrimination. And I'm adding here the group association A or B, right? And a the differential item functioning factor. What we have for group A is that basically we lose this last part of the diff, right? And we have this function that is a 2PL pretty much. And for group B, we have this diff factor that is added to this function. Now, the probability should be the same, but in this case, it clearly is not the same. The functions show you here very explicitly how the probability of these two functions to respond to an item correctly, depending on which group you are, is not equal. And what is the problem with that? That basically, when we are giving this test and this item specifically, the people, depending on the group they come from, they could be as not knowledgeable, but they are not going to be able to respond necessarily to the question correctly because they have different probabilities. And this is a problem of fairness. So we can apply different diff methods. And we had data, Gypsy, this professor, gave us data from the midterm and final exams. The data was a multiple choice exam, 40 questions on each of the exams. It was administered via Canvas, in person, and proctored. And each exam consisted on 8 questions randomly selected from 5 assigned chapters. Now, here's an important characteristic that even though I'm not showing you, but I'm telling you, the data was missing by design because questions were randomly selected, right? And so we don't have the same number of responses for each item and across groups to be able to say, oh, you know, we have a lot of responses. However, we have a lot of participants. We're talking about over 1,500 participants. This is also a highlight on this project, and a highlight that allows me to run type of diff methods, but also to say that it is unimaginable how you can be how you can have measures of accountability of your students when you have such larger classes. I've taught classes as a graduate student, and none of my classes were larger than 30 students. And 30 students like grading their assignments and tests, etc., is a lot. So I understand why we cannot move, you know, far away from applying or using assessments, because otherwise, what are we gonna use when you have one professor, even if you have several TAs or 2 or 3 professors? Is it still a lot of work? It's considerably work for accountability. Let's talk a little bit too about how diverse was this class. If you look at the composition of this class, we see mainly men, we see mainly white people, and we see that most of the people here are non-first generation. This is a sample of the structure of the business school because it's just one class in one specific semester, but I don't think it's the outlier, you know, it's definitely not the outlier. I think most of the classes are consistently showing this type of diversity. And what this diversity shows is that this class was mainly dominated by white men who had some knowledge of what college is like because they were in the first generation. And so educationally, I believe that it also shows the system within the business school. With this regard, and also knowing that we have missing by design, it's not that we have, you know, in each item, 1,000 students that are white, and then the rest that are like 204 Asians or 104 Latinos. Actually, we have much less because of the missing by design. And then let's imagine we have only 100. It's hard to make any inferences if we were to compare 68 against, you know, two Black or African American people. Therefore, I group white versus non-white because of the limitations of the data. So what are the results? I compared 3 different diff methods, and this is usual. You use 3 or more diff methods, and you see if among all those diff methods, the same item gets flagged. As you can see, the red numbers here are identified as diff items for each of these methods. And you can see if any of those items are flagged if 2 or more methods point them out to have them. And so at least use 3 different methods. That's important. And if you're interested to see why the methods show different results, I would gladly clarify on the Q&A session. Let's talk about results. So this professor came with the question of white versus non-white people. And we found that a lot of the items were biased. In the midterm, 9 out of 100 items were biased, and in the final exam, 12 out of 100 items were biased. But I additionally conducted this analysis for gender and first generation, and also found several biased items, which is kind of expected given given the context that I gave you from the School of Business. Now, as a psychometrician, I think my job kind of ends here with the sense of I provided the results that she was looking for, but sadly I don't have business is not my area of expertise, so I don't have as much knowledge in business. And therefore, I gave these professors some recommendations of what to do once we identify these items as bias. In general, in high stakes assessments, standardized assessments, usually they just eliminate these items and then they proceed to, keep administering the test with new items from the pool of items. But when it comes to classes in the university, this is hard, like it's hard to do. It's hard to produce items. It's hard to write so many items. And I think it's also hard to just dismiss the items completely. So I propose restructuring the items based on how are the questions worded. For example, and just as an example, right? If there's negative wording in the question, that's confusing. If the readability of the question is not clear, that also could be confusing, causing some type of diff. There is also the idea of the cultural use of certain words or context. And an example that I like to give is that I grew up in Bolivia, and I remember that even in high school, I had mathematics practices and assessments and physics too that include baseball in their questions. And so I'm not a sports fan, but I don't think any Bolivian knows much about baseball. And I know it's very typical in the US, and I understand my teachers like took questions from Google or whatever to actually evaluate us. But I feel that that was adding something that was completely unnecessary to measure my knowledge in math. Was kind of confused by this knowledge in baseball that I didn't have, that probably most US people do, because at least they have a notion of what baseball is about. Once we restructure the items, I suggest to retest the restructure items to see if they still flag as diff. And also I propose that it would be interesting to, if these methods are conducted during the semester, which wasn't the case, we should eliminate those items from the scoring process. That way, the final score would be more fair for the groups that are participating in our class. The takeaways, hire a psychometrician. Joking aside, it's important to have people who actually know how to conduct these methods and why to conduct specific methods for specific data. And that's why I think it's important to have one in your team. Also, there was a moment of talks or discussions of automatizing this type of methods. And I advised against it because each test is different, each data is different. And as I said, we need specific ways to deal with that. Second, it's a collaborative effort. And I see a lot of lack of collaboration from different areas, but we should collaborate. I mean, I think, I'm sure, I know actually the Michigan, at Michigan, you have people who run this type of analysis, or who are being educated to run this analysis. So while we might not know your specific area, working together to identify items that could have bias or diff is super important as a first step, into moving into more equitable type of assessment. And last is that we can find evidence of bias and diff, and this should be a prerequisite of making fair comparisons among groups, particularly when it comes to research. It should be like an assumption that we make sure that when we're comparing among groups, and these comparisons are based, let's say, on final scores, and our final scores are highly weighted on assessments, then at least we should make sure that we're measuring the same thing across different groups. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well done. Okay, so yes. So my first question is, you noted that there are differences observed between a variety of the different groups. Was there overlap in the questions that were problematic, or were these broadly problematic for different reasons for the different groups?
Can you clarify, what do you mean by overlap?
Yeah, so if you look at the slide that has your breakdown of this, of, the instructor had asked you for white, non-white differences, you have looked at gender, and you have looked at first gen.
I see what you're saying. Okay, yes, in some
Is it
cases there
15
was.
problematic questions? Yeah.
So not all 15 were the 9 that were in white versus non-white. So, but some of them were. I think in total there were 25, like across these all methods. But of course, when we think of these methods, we're also thinking on a very specific scenario where there's a reference group and there's a focal group, or that's how we call it at least. And as any person would agree with me if I say that white versus non-white, the problems that are behind the cultural differences there are not the same as men versus women, and are not going to be necessarily the same as first generation to non-first generation. So while there were, some overlapping questions, I still think that there is not necessarily one way to analyze them and see them.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to code what the problem is with each of the problem questions, and think about what are the sources of challenge in each question as it relates to the different groups.
And that's the part where I think I would like to emphasize the collaboration, because definitely the experts on the area need to realize what could be causing this, right? As a psychometrician or even statistician, the method is serving to flag items, but it's not telling you exactly where is the problem, right? And
it's
that's what I
revealing
say.
Something, but
right, it's just like a step into moving into equity. Yeah.
And interpretation is key. Okay, questions that people have. This was such a lovely talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I'm just going to open the chat as well in case.
Yeah. Dan has a great comment about infrastructure being a real opportunity to make it as easy to examine these as possible.
Infrastructure, perhaps should make it easier to examine examining.
Dan, do you want to characterize anything about?
It's Canvas made it a lot easier. I know I spent a lot of time teaching faculty how to use the quiz engine in Canvas. I mean, the fact that there's 8 item formats by 4 quiz formats is just overwhelming, and it's a nice meaty topic for some of my research. But I have found it very easy, both in that context as well as in my graduate assessment course context, to teach people how to analyze the discriminability of each item. And it doesn't seem like I'm not a I used to be a psychometrician. I'm actually a recovering psychometrician,
right?
and I was never a very good one. But I don't know enough about coding, programming, and the methods of diff. But I don't know. It just seems like, wouldn't that be awesome if you could just tag your learners by subgroup membership, and then InStructure would, Canvas would generate a straightforward analysis that would flag your items that function differentially, the way that they flag items that where the performance is uncorrelated with performance on the overall exam in the D analysis.
Thank you, Dan, for suggesting this. So this was also a conversation that we had both with the professor and actually my boss at IU. And I think something that came up mainly from my side was that if we were to automatize this type of analysis, whereas I think it's possible, I'm a little bit afraid that not students, but professors are going to use these type of methods, regardless of what the method needs, or the type of data that it needs, or the type of assumptions that it requires. And I am a little bit afraid about automatizing. I think it would be great if at some point this could be possible, but I am afraid it could go on the wrong direction, and
Point taken, and they wouldn't need to hire psychometricians like you.
And also because we want a job.
Good, thank you.
Good
Nice
to see
job,
you, Dan.
Montserrat. Proud of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Becky.
Thank you, Monty, so much. As a side note, I do have a vague memory that at Michigan State, some level of differential item functioning is like institutionalized as like sort of part of the process of instructors having, big, large assessments that they used to like run all through this like Scantron office. And I think that office used to do a bunch of differential item functioning. I don't know. I don't know if it, I don't know if that is still part and parcel of everyday life there, but anyway, I had a couple questions, but I'll ask one. So I remember, there's these reasons, kind of more obvious reasons why one item might not function so well for a given group than another. Negative wording, or like the baseball example, cultural knowledge. But I'm wondering, like, what do you do, or what do you say to a faculty member who comes across an item that is statistically biased, but like they really don't understand why? Like they really don't understand, the interpretation is like just not available either to them or maybe to others. So like, if we're looking at an assessment that had some biased items, but whoever was, really in charge of the interpretation kind of couldn't figure it out, like, what do you say to them? Do you say like, okay, keep it, try again with another data sample? Or do you say like, no, pitch it? I don't know. What do you think?
I would eliminate it. Actually, that's how, and I think I said it, that's how most, assessment go about it. If an item is detected or flagged as biased, they just take it out and they don't administer again. The reason why I like talk so much about restructuring and retesting, etc., it's because I think that's so hard for, as professors or teachers, it's so hard to actually do that, given that we're not institutions where we can pay for writing items all the time, right? We write the items ourselves. So I would eliminate it if I cannot identify what's happening and I have evidence, because I think that's the part. If you have evidence now, you need to do something about it. And the end decision is going to be on you, but I would eliminate it both from the scoring process and from any further administration. Thank you. Also,
Okay,
I wanted to say, based on your observation before, there's a lot of item analysis that is run on IU Canvas structure and data, in general. And I don't know of any diff, at least at IU, that's being run like largely. But yes, item analysis.
other questions?
Oh, that's such a great observation, Dan. So there is a famous item that is used in several papers as an example of how certain words are known by, let's say, people who have a very specific knowledge of English. And I'm not talking about English as second language learners, which of course it's one of the hard words, but also they detected that there were differences in classes, social class, and this type of use of words like oarsman and regatta when doing associations of what words belong to them. And again, right, once they find this evidence, they just eliminated that item and try to be more conscious about what wording we're using.
It's really fascinating. I'll say I've seen some interesting debates where, you know, for people, it has, yes, you can see biased outcomes, and yet the observed feeling is that it represents a gap in knowledge that was important for the assessment, right? And how do you grapple with that?
Yeah.
Okay, Stefano, you have a question?
Montserrat, I was wondering if you could, if there's some thoughts or how to think about the potential difference that there is between assessing a construct and teaching a construct, and how that might relate to the outcome when you are testing the knowledge on a certain construct as an item, if it makes sense.
It does, actually. So it's an interesting point that you highlight this, or that you question this, Stefano. I was recently reading a paper, and I think that's, I'm just going to go back to this slide, or okay, it doesn't really matter, but the new ways in which we can think of fairness in assessment, or at least how my field is moving, is walking away from equality, you know, of saying everyone should be taught the same, to a more culturally responsive assessment. And for that, there are specific parts that need to be taken into account. So for example, first, defining culture. I mean, that's really hard. What's going to be a culture, and thinking about intersectionality and all of this, to be able to teach to these people in a way that matters for their life and knowledge, and cognitive knowledge as in their learning experience, if you want, and assessing them within that culturally responsive education. And this is something that we don't do nowadays. I think this is well known, but a lot of academic institutions teach and assess people where the majority is assumed to be white, you know, and for generations and generations, men. So it's interesting to see how these things are going to change in the future, not only in assessment, but also in education, moving more into fairness and justice, rather than just thinking about, you know, methods that address equality, which is where we are right now, at least where a lot of my research has been in.
Other questions? Monse, what do you feel like is your next, like, where are you heading with this research? What are you excited about next?
Well, largely I've been doing about this particular project, or like my
I think within the realm of fairness and assessment. How about that?
Great. That sounds great. So I hope I can, you know, I'm about to graduate, and I think that that's such an important part on one's career, in terms of defining who do you want to be now that you have finished a big chunk of your career. And a lot of my research has been in international large-scale assessments, which I anticipate I will continue, because I, of course, have developed a lot of questions throughout this process. But I would really like to move into culturally responsive assessments, and what does it mean to talk about race in assessments, and justice in terms of decolonization, and justice in terms of gender as well. So there's a lot of oppressed groups, you know, socially, and the constructs of critical theory and assessment that I don't think have been completely merged, that are starting to be merged in my field, where I would like to continue my career. Thank you, Kate. And thank you everyone for the questions.
Yeah. Well, I would love for people to take a moment to thank Monsi for such a fantastic talk. This has been lovely. Yes, excellent use of emojis. Lots of options for that. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you and best of luck tomorrow. I hope it's a fun conversation.
Thank you so much, Kate. And thanks again to you and Becky for inviting me for this talk.
Very happy to have had you. Wonderful.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.